So please, Maria Ole, when you are ready to start broadcasting the conference, the talk, let me know. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you all had a chance to get some rest and you are now ready for our next section. Now I would like to invite Professor Guilherme Lourenço to introduce our second speaker, Professor Ronnie Wilbur, who on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank for kindly accepting our invitation. Before handing the word to Professor Guilherme, I will briefly introduce him. Professor Guilherme Lourenço holds a PhD in Theoretical and Descriptive Linguistics from the graduate program in linguistics at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, with a sandwich period at Purdue University. He is a professor at the College of Letters at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, working mainly in the Libras undergraduate program. He has taught at the University of Brasilia, at the Federal University of Ouro Preto, at the State University of Minas Gerais, and has also worked at the Training Center for Professionals in Education and Assistance to People with Deafness in Minas Gerais, in educational sign language interpreters training. He has experience in the areas of sign language, linguistics, and Libras Portuguese translation and interpretation. Thank you very much, Professor Guilherme, for being with us today. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you can hear me just fine. And good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome to the talk by Dr. Ronnie Wilbur. It's really a great pleasure to be here and to introduce Dr. Wilbur, who I had the honor of having her as one of my PhD advisors. So thank you, Andrea, and all the organizers for inviting me to this task. Well, if you are familiar with sign language linguistics, you definitely know Ronnie Wilbur's work, and you don't need an introduction. But we need to mention that her research has been groundbreaking, and she has contributed a lot to our understanding, not only of sign language structure, but of the human language capacity in general. So since the 1980s, she's a professor of linguistics at Purdue University in Indiana, and at Purdue, she's the director of the Sign Language Research Lab. Her work, which is pretty extensive, includes more than 200 publications, but the relevance of Dr. Wilbur's research goes beyond numbers. To name just a few, she provided the first evidence that knowledge of sign language in deaf children does not interfere with the acquisition of English, and that their literacy difficulties can be traced to other causes, such as insufficient input and interaction, or even to teaching approaches. And she has also demonstrated that signed languages have syllables and standard types of stress patterns, like spoken languages do. She has contributed to the description of the grammatical structure, not only of ASL, the American Sign Language, but also other sign languages around the globe, like Turkish Sign Language, Croatian Sign Language, Austrian Sign Language, and even Libras in the joint work we did together. She has conducted theoretical analyses that are supported by experimental psycholinguistic and neurolinguistic paradigms. So she has used motion capture, EEG, fMRI to do her research. Yeah, and more recently, her event visibility hypothesis has triggered many investigations on the phonology semantics interface, not only in sign languages. So as you can see, Ronnie has contributed widely to the field of sign language linguistics and to linguistics in general. And I may add that she's not only brilliant, but she's an incredible human being. So today we have the honor of having her talking about similarities and differences in the prosodic structure of signed and spoken languages. Thank you, Ronnie, so much for giving us a talk today. I'm really looking forward to hearing it. But before Ronnie has the screen, I'd like to remind our audience that you can ask any question you want in the chat. So you don't need to wait for the end of the talk. As we move along, you can type your questions here. And at the end of the talk, we also have about 10 minutes for questions and answers. At that time, if you prefer, you can open your mic and camera and ask your question directly to Ronnie. And you can even do that in Libras if you want. And your question will be interpreted to English. Okay, so Ronnie, the screen is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Guilherme, and thank you all for being here. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk with you. I also hope that many of you had the opportunity to attend Martha Tyrone's presentation this morning, because she set up a number of things very nicely for me. And so I'm going to assume certain things that she told you so that I can spend more time on trying to give you a better sense of what it is I think we know and what we don't know, or we might not know. So first of all, there we go. What I want to do is start by just making sure that we have some agreement on whether we're talking about the same thing when we talk about prosody. And I want to divide my comparison of speech and signing into two parts, one in which we look at rhythm, syllables, and stress, and the other in which we look at intonation, because my concern is going to be on attempting to clear up misconceptions that I think people have about what would constitute a reasonable analog of intonation for sign languages. So first, what do we mean by prosody? And I'm assuming that quite a number of you in the audience are speech scientists, broadly defined, and that when we talk about prosody, you would agree with me that rhythmic phrasing is part of what we're talking about, and that modeling rhythmic phrasing with the prosodic hierarchy and beyond that is an important part of doing prosody. And syllables and stress, recognizing stress and modeling stress assignment is also part of what we mean by prosody. And finally, that intonation and how to model it would be under the rubric of prosody. Now, for sign researchers, rhythmic phrasing is in fact part of it. And I will spend a bit of time talking about the fact that although some speech scientists have moved beyond the prosodic hierarchy, in sign languages research so far, we really haven't, and this is something that needs to be done. Looking at syllables and stress, I'd like to give you some comparisons between signing and speech so that you understand where the differences exist in terms of syllables and stress assignment and where they don't exist, that is, where everything is exactly the same. And finally, to deal with the question of what could be intonation in a language or in a language modality that doesn't have pitch. So what could it be and how should we model it? So when we're talking about rhythmic phrasing, briefly now, we talk about pausing and breathing and boundary tones. And when we talk about signing rhythmic phrasing, we also talk about pausing, so same. But what's boundary tone going to look like? All right. Well, what are some possibilities? Initially, people looked at the hands returning to rest, but clearly in actual signing, your hands don't return to rest between every sentence or between every phrase within a sentence. So that really didn't, get us much. Blinking and head nods have been looked at, and so has the loss of muscle tension. And what evidence shows so far is that blinking and some head nods are probably good analogs to boundary tones, as well as loss of certain muscle tension. So I will come back to these in just a couple of minutes to give you more details. When we're talking about syllables and stress, In speech, we're talking stress being represented by changes in duration and pitch and amplitude. And we're talking about stress assignment on syllables, syllables and words, words and phrases, phrases and sentences. And the modeling has included various approaches, metrical structure, and Hallie and Verneux's essay on stress, which was an attempt to look cross-linguistically at what's going on. Now, when we get to signing, and we start to talk about stress, when you read the literature, you see that a number of things have been suggested, not all of which pan out. So duration has been discussed as a correlate to stress, but it turns out that that's not actually reliable. Another thing that's interesting is height in space. That is literally the sign is moved up in space when it's stressed. I'll come back to that. And then from motion capture research, looking at peak velocity. When we look at stress assignment, it's basically the same as it is in speech, looking on syllables, syllables and words, words and phrases, phrases and sentences. And the modeling of stress in signing actually goes all the way back to 1973. And I've made some attempts at adding to that literature. It's been quite a while, but I think it's important. And one observation that I would just make is that looking at Hallie and Verneux's model for speech seems to work pretty well, at least for American Sign Language. And here's where looking at other sign languages might be interesting as well. Now, when we get to intonation, here's where we have some issues. When we're talking about speech, the primary thing that we mean by intonation is pitch. And our modeling of intonation includes things like Pierre Humbert and Beckman's observations that Japanese tone structure look very much like intonation, and Ladd's intonational phonology, and Cruttenden's textbook on intonation. They all have slightly different definitions, but pretty similar. Whereas I would say in signing right now, what we have is a general state of confusion, and I will attempt to explain why in a minute. And it's been modeled as prosody by Sandler and others, as syntax by Neidl and others, as multiple things by Wiest, with measurements to support her, and also as multiple things by me. I would have to say I've made at least 4 claims, all of them different, but I like to think that what I've done is learn from my mistakes. And so I'm going to try to give you a better sense of where we might want to look. Okay, so why do we have the confusion? Well, if we start with modeling prosodic structure and the prosodic hierarchy, I assume that you're all pretty familiar with the idea that, the lower end, you have syllables, and in the middle, you have phonological phrases and words, and at the end, you have intonational phrases. And along with this comes the strict layering hypothesis, which is a sticking point that I will return to on the next slide. And in 2011, Selkirk, in her chapter in the Handbook of Phonological Theory, basically argued that we needed to move beyond strict layering because it was inaccurate. So let me explain what I'm talking about here. What Selkirk noted was that the perspective of the phonological hierarchy, prosodic hierarchy, was that you had a purely prosodic structure strictly arranged in the categories of prosodic type on the hierarchy that was purely phonological, that syntax simply was not involved, and that what you had was this basic strict layering hypothesis that each constituent consisted of only the layer right below that constituent, so that you had immediately dominating category one level below. So what might that look like? And I would give you this tree on the left. And if we look at the top, we have iota, which is intonation phrase. And then you have these prosodic phrases that are essentially sisters to each other. And they each dominate prosodic words, one or more of them. But what you have is prosodic phrases here are only sisters to prosodic phrases, and prosodic words are only sisters to prosodic words. And what Selkirk wanted you to know was that a violation of strict layering hypothesis might look something more like this funny looking tree on the right, where what you have is, for example, these prosodic phrases. The upper one is dominating the lower one, which is a violation of the n over n minus 1 hierarchy. Also, you see that the prosodic phrase on the right has as its sister a prosodic word, and that's also a violation. And then finally, if we look at the top, you not only see that the iota intonation phrase dominates another one, which consists of this funny stuff on the left, but on top of that, the right branch consists of a prosodic word directly attached to the top level, which is a category 2 levels below instead of 1 level below, and that's also a violation. And it turns out that Selkirk was able to document that these violations, in fact, exist. So she said, this isn't going to work. We got to step back and have another look. So what she came up with was the idea, which she calls the match hypothesis, where you take your syntactic structures and you take your prosodic structures and you have some kind of correspondence between them. So fundamentally, if you have a syntactic clause, you should have a matching prosodic clause. If you have a syntactic phrase, you should have a corresponding prosodic phrase. If you have a syntactic word, you should have a corresponding phonological word, prosodic word. Okay, now in the ideal world, that would give you a very nice, neat match between everything. So what? Well, in the ideal world where you have this nice, neat matching, it doesn't work that way. Because what happens is that you get higher ranked phonological markedness constraints on the prosodic structure that may lead to violations of the match constraints. And that produces instances of non-isomorphism between the syntactic constituency on one hand, literally, and on the phonological / prosodic structure on the other hand. So let me just give you a for instance. Let me show you how easy it is to get non-isomorphy in speech. In standard English, we have the sentence with 4 syllables, did you eat yet? In my fast New York dialect, I can say this in 2 syllables. Ji, yet. And that first syllable, ji, corresponds to the standard English, did you eat, which is a constituent with the modifier yet on it. But that ji is not 3 syllables, it's 1 syllable. standard syntax here is 3 pieces. And the answer to this question in standard English is no. Did you? But in my dialect, that's also 2 syllables. No, ju, which corresponds to the tag question here. Did you? Okay, so fast speech production doesn't match each syntactic constituent, but each prosodic word matches a syntactic constituent, which can contain smaller ones inside of it. So by the time you end up with your phonology being done with everything, there's still a correspondence, but it's no longer one-to-one. Why do we care? Well, here's the problem. It's the existence of non-isomorphism between prosodic structure and syntax that has led some sign language researchers to reject claims that certain markings are syntactic or semantic or morphological, and to claim instead that they're prosodic. But following Selkirk, with the match theory, we actually expect there to be non-isomorphism between the phonology and the syntax. But that doesn't mean that the markings are there because they indicate prosody, rather than they're there because they indicate syntax or semantics or morphology. So the distinction I hope to be leading you to is that the markers are at least functionally morphemic. That is, they're there because they do something. They're there because they mean something. And that once they're placed into a sentence, they must obey whatever prosodic rules apply to them. But they're not markers of prosody. Now, what that means is I'm going to have to separate prosodic markers from non-prosodic markers. So, seatbelts fastened, here we go. First, we're going to compare speech and sign and rhythm, and look at rhythmic phrasing and pauses, where we're going to see similarities between speech and signing. Speech has got the boundary tones, and the pausing in speech between constituents reflects the constituent hierarchy. So the longest pauses are between sentences. They're shorter between lower or lesser syntactic constituents, and they're shortest inside a constituent, if there's any pausing at all. And the signing works the same way. Pausing between the constituents reflects the constituent hierarchy. So that's really kind of nice. Like speech, pause durations decrease with lesser syntactic boundaries, but one minor difference, or at least as far as we know it's a minor difference, the pause durations in signing are generally shorter than those observed for speech. Okay. We will look at a difference now, the rate effects on pausing. So speakers adjust the amount of time they pause by altering the number of pauses, but not the pause durations. And in part, that's because the minimum duration of a pause is what's needed for a breath. Whereas signers adjust the amount of time they spend articulating, changing the movement parameter. And they change both the number and the duration of pauses. So the signers adjust the sign duration, number of pauses, pause duration. But one interesting thing that we've observed is that the number of signs that are produced is not affected. So you can get signers to go from a slow to a normal to a really fast rate with memorized scripts, and they don't just drop out signs to speed up. And what's interesting about this is that this it contrasts, I should say, with results reported by myself and Lisa Peterson when we looked at speaking and signing at the same time, where experienced signers would speed up their signing by massively omitting signs to try to keep up on their signing while they were speaking. So the speech set the pace and the hands couldn't keep up. So they just dropped signs. And these were really, really experienced, in some cases, native signers, hearing native signers trying to speak and sign at the same time. But deaf signers who are just signing can change the signing rate without dropping out signs. So that was a nice finding. But another difference then between signing and speaking shows up between breathing and blinking. So speakers breathe during pauses and not during the middle of a word. In fact, speakers are almost prevented from breathing in the middle of the word, as air intake, taking the air in, disrupts articulation airflow out, which we do see in motor speech disorders, such as Parkinson's. But signers can breathe anytime they want. Now, in contrast, speakers can blink anywhere they please, but the blink locations in signing are linguistically determined. So let's look at eye blinks for a moment. In their ocular system description, Stern and Dunham noted 3 types of eye blinks. There's the startle reflex, like when something scares you. There's the periodic involuntary eye wetting, because you need to keep your eyes wet. And then there's the voluntary blinking. If I ask you to blink and you blink, that's a voluntary blink. They noted that the frequency of periodic blinking is affected by perceptual and cognitive demands. So something like 18.4 blinks per minute while speaking, dropping down to 3.6 blinks per minute while watching video screens, like you're doing now. And readers tend to hold their blinking until they get to appropriate places in their text. So the ends of sentences, the ends of paragraphs, the ends of pages. Periodic blinking in signing tends to occur at the end of intonational phrases, sometimes lesser constituents, but almost predictably at the ends of intonational phrases, parallel to boundary tones in speech. Voluntary blinks, on the other hand, tend to co-occur with lexical signs. And voluntary blinks are slower and longer than periodic blinks. Voluntary blinks tend to perform semantic and/or information functions of emphasis, assertion, or stress. So let's take a quick look at blinks. Here on the numbers, these are video frames. So these are 4 consecutive video frames. This is a slow blink because the eye is open, then the lid is halfway down, then it's all the way closed, then it's all the way open. In a eye-wetting blink, you would go directly from open to closed to open without this part way. You got to look at a lot of blinks to see this. Okay, so some additional fun facts. There are occasions in which a head nod may substitute for a blink or co-occur with one at a boundary. And I know that there was some discussion about head nods this morning, and I was intrigued to hear about that. Now, the signing rate effects, both blinks and head nods are affected when the signing rate changes. In the faster signing productions, signers drop or run together some markers. So blinks and head nods may be dropped, but brow raises may run together, producing signs more quickly by compressing the durations of signs and the intervening pauses. And since I mentioned brow raise, I'm just going to give you one sentence on this right now because we'll return to it. Brow raise in American Sign Language is used to mark certain type of questions, conditional clauses, relative clauses, topics, among others. So let's turn next to syllables because we're heading towards stress and we can't do the stress without the syllables. We can't do the syllables without the phrases. So similarities between speech and signing. Syllables exist. They can be counted. They can be tapped. An interesting thing is that signers, native signers, ignore transitional movements between syllables when they're tapping. But non-signers who are watching the same video, they don't know it's transitional movement. And so they try to tap to the transitional movements as well as the regular lexical movements. Syllables are relevant to compounding, to metathesis, to fingerspelled loan signs. Syllables participate in reduplication. Interestingly, one type of reduplication for nominalization is sensitive to whether syllable is light or heavy. Light syllables can undergo it, heavy syllables can't. Whereas aspectual reduplication for things like habitual or durative, it ignores the heavy light distinction. Any syllable can undergo it. So syllables have certain things that they participate in. Now, I mention this in part because I'm reacting to a 2021 claim by Vanderholtz and Van de Puig, who reject the use of syllables in sign language analysis. They say it's unnecessary, claiming that most, if not all, lexical signs are monosyllabic. But the data doesn't support their claim, and I just want to show you a couple of differences. So here I show you the sign for arrive. So one hand moves towards the other hand and makes contact, and that is basically treated as one syllable. Whereas the sign baby involves a movement one way and then the other way, and that's treated as one sign, one morpheme, two syllables. Another two-syllable sign is the sign for cancel. Now, cancel has a movement across the palm, down at an angle, and then a transitional movement up to the start of the next syllable, and then a movement down. And it's that transition movement between the end of the first syllable and the beginning of the second part that signers ignore when tapping and non-signers don't. The sign for mother is interesting because it's not a syllable. It's a sign, it's a morpheme, but it's less than a syllable because it doesn't have its own movement. The movement that you get with it to make a legal syllable is the hand shape, moving the hand to the chin and or moving the hand away from the chin. So transition movements make up most of the syllable that has the sign mother in it, but the sign mother itself is treated as not being a syllable. And just to show you some versions of the sign to give, where you see one movement then you see a repeated movement, and you see a distributive movement, and you see a repeated movement inside a distributive movement, and you see a distributive movement inside a repeated movement, and so on. We treat these as single signs, except for the lexical item, where there's a debate about whether it's monomorphemic or multimorphemic. All these others are clearly multiple morphemes, multiple syllables, but we would count them as one sign. They're not a lexical sign, but they're one sign. Here I just want to show you what a tapping study looks like. This was done so long ago that there's no computerized version of this. This is all hand-drawn to tapping of a wand on a copper plate, creating an electrical signal to the computer. And the story here is that a car has broken down ahead, causing a lot of disorder, and the person had to wait for a long time. So the signs are know that, highway, cars in a row, why, car, there, collapsed, and wait for a long time is done like this. It's done like a version of the give for a long time at the end. And you see here, these are 3 subjects tapping. Each dot is a tap. They saw this 30 times. Here you see the 3 taps for each version of wait that was produced. And you see each of the subjects here has that. These are all deaf signers. And you see there's a lot of agreement, but not total agreement, between where the peaks are that they're tapping to. So this brings me to differences. One of the things that we learned from the tapping study and that we have had to deal with over time is that there are differences between the internal structure of spoken syllables and internal structure of sign syllables. It's a modality effect. You would expect it. Instead of sequential equivalence to consonants and vowels, which people have tried to model, there's simultaneous overlapping of place of articulation, handshake, and movement, which Martha introduced to you this morning. And one can get a review of internal structures. I'm not going to go into it here. I just wanted to let you know, inside the syllable, they're very different. I got to stop signing. From spoken syllables. But once you get to the syllable level and you start looking at syllables and stress and everything above that, it's remarkably similar, which I will now address. So for signing, it was suggested that duration might be relevant to stress, but it's not. It's the main marker of phrasal position, phrase final lengthening, for example, and height in the signing space, literally moving the whole sign up into the viewer's central visual acuity area is a good way to highlight that you want to stress a sign because it makes it stick out from the other signs. We also know from motion capture that peak velocity, peak speed, is a reliable indicator of where the stress is located. And also, stress involves muscle tension, whereas unstressed signs tend to have less. And we're starting a project now with Austrian Sign Language to look at muscle tension as well. There are some differences in stress assignment at the word level, but they're not differences in modality. They're differences in language specifics. So unlike English, ASL lexical stress is predictable. English lexical stress involves syllable weight. Even though there's weight distinctions in syllables in at least American Sign Language, the stress assignment is completely independent of the syllable weight. And there are no minimal pairs, in ASL at least, that crucially depend on stress placement. And part of the reason is, of course, that most signs are monosyllabic. When you get to morphemes that have more than one syllable, there's a limited set of ways that you can get them, and the stress is completely predictable on those as well. Now, the first way is to take a reduplicated sign. So if I make the sign for sit, and I reduplicate it, I get chair. What happens is that reduplicated form gets frozen, and only the first syllable is prominent. The second one is smaller and faster. When you also have morphemes that start out as two syllables, I showed you, for example, baby, which has two movements, where the second movement is 180 degrees from the first. Or I showed you cancel, where the second syllable is rotated 90 degrees from the first. Okay? In these two situations, the prominence is equal on both syllables. Okay, so the ASL morphemic disyllables are exceptional with respect to lexical stress because they both syllables have equal stress. Otherwise, though, the first syllable is stressed. And that is basically the accentuation principle that we've known for speech since Kaparsky and Hulley. They said, stress the leftmost accented vowel, or in the absence of accented vowels, the leftmost syllable. Reworded in terms of syllables for ASL, stress the leftmost syllable. So at the level where syllables interface with metrical structure, namely in the assignment of lexical stress, there's no evidence of a modality effect. Compounds have stress on the second syllable. Phrases have stress on the rightmost constituent. So the assignment of stress to compounds and syntactic phrases follows the general pattern. Stress the most prominent syllable of the rightmost lexical item. Okay. One more thing to get us up to intonation. This is a language-specific difference, again, not a modality-specific difference. English can move the stress for contrastive purposes. So you see here the same words with birthday stressed, shirt stressed, Harry stressed, Ellen stressed. English is what we call plastic. American Sign Language is minus plastic. You cannot move. The stress tends to stay in final position, loosely defined. The word order is adjusted to put focus in final position, which I will now show you. Here is Ellen gave Harry a new shirt for his birthday. When Ellen gave Harry a new shirt was for his birthday. What Ellen gave Harry was a new shirt for his birthday. What Ellen gave Harry for his birthday was a new shirt. For his birthday, what Ellen gave Harry was a new shirt. The person who Ellen gave a new shirt for his birthday was Harry. And in each of these cases, the stress is on the focused, which is on the end. And you notice these brow raises. And I want to draw your attention to this one in particular, where we have a topic brow raise and a brow raise that's on the WH clause, which you see all of these have. And we have the reset, the gap between them. So the question is this intonation? Well, typically in intonation, you have the boundary tones with interpolation between them, and it signals continuation or completion or something. And occasionally, intonation is phonemic. That is, it creates a minimal pair. So, for example, the difference between "you're coming with me" and "you're coming with me" is intonational. And maybe you know of other such cases. But some sign researchers think that this case is the analogy for intonation. And I think this is problematic. So let's look at what Wiest did when she tried to figure out if brow raise was behaving like intonation. And just briefly, she looked at 6 signers. She looked at 3 different structures: yes, no questions, WH questions, and statements in different emotional categories. And her findings were that brow raise goes up for yes, no questions and down for WH questions, but the percentages in neutral were different than the percentages when you put the structures in different emotions. So let's look here. Here you see yes, no question, peak brow height. The black is surprise, gray is happy, neutral, sad, and angry. In the middle, you see the statements, and on the right, you see the WH question. So you clearly see that brow raise is correlated with syntax and affect. She wanted to see if this was true for hearing non-signers. She looked at pitch and eyebrows in a hearing non-signer and found no correlation there. She did look at pixel height of the brows across sentences. And these are the different affects, without going through all of the things you see here, that there's a declination at the ends of the statements. It's raining now. And in the WH questions, you have lower starts, goes up for eat and down for what. If you have just where is it raining, and you start with rain, you see you're not anywhere up near the top here, and then it goes down further for the WH. If you have a yes, no question, it goes up. And in some cases, you see it starts at a certain case, goes down so that it can go up. And you see a number of cases where you have the raising up. She argues that the ASL non-manuals should not be compared to pitch in English, but rather to layering through pitch in tone languages. Tone languages can have a lexical tone over a word and still express emotion using pitch as well. Another reason why the non-manuals is not a good analog for intonation is that one of the things we think of intonation doing in speech is holding the sentence together to separate it from a mere list of words in sequence. And the non-manuals don't do this. In fact, we believe that it's the movement of the hands that are going to carry this. And I want to show you one last graph that looks at a mathematical analysis of a motion capture of the dominant hand, the non-dominant hand, and the head in 48 three-sentence narratives. So this is a measure of fractal complexity, and the, there we go, okay. The dominant hand has the highest, the non-dominant hand has the next most, The head has similar to the non-dominant hand, and both of these are significantly below the dominant hand. And these two little guys here are controls. Those are your ankles. Okay. So you see that there's a difference in where the information complexity is carried by the hands and the head. So I'm going to, I'm going to go right here. One proposal that I'm going to end with was the idea that the brow raise would be forward-looking continuation. And this example was given where exercise class has a brow raise on it. And the reason that was given was that it has a sentence following it. More information to follow. But the problem with this analysis, this pragmatic analysis, is that why you don't get a brow raise on I hope, which is followed by sisters succeed, or why you don't get it on I hope sisters succeed, which is followed by persuade mother, or why you don't get it on I hope sisters succeed, persuade mother, which is followed by take up. In short, why is there no brow raise on everything that's not the last word? Since each is, in fact, followed by more information. Okay? So back here, we've got this brow raise and the reset between it. And why would you get, if it's just there's more information to follow, why would you get a break here? Why don't you get a break between Ellen give Harry what and then for his birthday? But you cannot get breaks here. And you only get the break here in careful signing. Okay? So this analysis leaves us with a lot of questions. And I'm going to skip to my last slide, so bear with me for a moment. Skip the syntax. Okay, so what does this tell us? Non-manuals are there to reflect the syntax and semantic functions. Given Selkirk's match theory of alignment and prosody, we expect the prosody to reflect the syntax, but not completely isomorphic. And once a non-manual is present in the sentence, for whatever its function is, then like everything else in the sentence, it obeys the prosodic rules. And that's the answer. So I'd like to thank my funding sources and my lab crew and my colleagues and you for bearing with me. And now we will take questions. And I'll stop sharing.
Hi, Ronnie. I just got to know from the organizers that you can go on if you want. You can talk until 3:15. If you can go back a few slides and end up and wrap up your talk, that would be awesome.
Okay, what I was going to do...
The syntactic aspect, if you will.
Yeah, what I was going to do was go through Churn and just show that she is able to... yeah, it's okay. How about if I do it right here? Hang on, Guillermo. I think. Yeah, so is this going to work? Yes. Okay. I just want to basically remind people that the pauses and the blinks and the head nods and the change in the lower face, those are all marking at the end of phrases. And they perform the same functions as boundary tones and pausing in speech. But we want to divide the domain markers, the ones that are held for the duration of a phrase, like those I was showing you from Wiest, into the brow lowering ones and the brow raising ones and the negative head shakes because they behave differently. And the thing about the brow position is that there's 3 linguistically significant positions. There's the up, the down, and the neutral. And the actual height, as we've seen, varies by emotional state. The neutral brows occur on ordinary assertions, and what you get there is whatever the emotional state is. Whereas the lower brows and the raised brows get embedded into the emotional states. The interesting thing about the raised brows is that they're all semantically restrictive, not all informationally old, as Coulter originally claimed, not all syntactically moved, as I at one point claimed, but all semantically restrictive. And what Chern did was she defined this little symbol here for a prosodic reset and a prosodic break. And she showed that she can predict the resets and the breaks completely from the syntactic structure. And what she did it with was this set of interesting triplets. The same signs, you eat, what, why, can mean 3 different things. What foods did you eat for what reasons? What foods did you eat and why did you eat it? And what foods did you eat and why did you eat it all? Okay, and they each have different syntactic derivations. And what she shows is that you get these resets between the change in the semantic focus, and you get the breaks between the syntactic constituents when they're moved. And so for each of the 3, she's able to show that you get the different results depending on what has moved and why it's moved. And that's where I was ending up. So there, thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Ronnie, for this amazing talk. We have a question in the chat, and I have a question of my own. So let's start with the question by Leticia. She's asking if you think that telic verbs tend to be more monomorphemic, I guess, than atelic verbs. What can you tell us about it?
Okay, I think first of all, my research shows it depends on the language. In Croatian Sign Language, it's clear that there is a verb root which adds an affix for atelic and an affix for telic. Just like some languages have clear markers, whether it's a prefix or a suffix, that adds to a verb for causative. So you take the verb, and if you want to say cause to happen, then you either have to put a prefix on the beginning or a suffix on at the end. In English, we also have verbs where the meaning of causative is hidden inside the word. Okay, so fall is not causative, but drop is causative. Drop means cause to fall. Okay, in English, we would say that drop is at least semantically complex because it has causative in its meaning, even though you can't see it. It's not a separate syllable. It's not a separate morpheme. You can't point to the D or the R or the O or the P and say, there's the causative. Okay. So in American Sign Language, the telics have a very clear end marking, which is a rapid deceleration to a stop. It is not a separable morpheme that you can add on to some new verb, okay, and say, okay, I'm going to make this one from an atelic into a telic. On the other hand, the telics are clearly identified by having that deceleration. So the problem arises when you start to ask, how do you count morphemes? If you are trying to figure out if something is monomorphemic or multimorphemic, I can give you examples from English where you can't answer that. Okay, so for example, cranberry has berry in it. Is that berry added to cran? Is the cran a morpheme? Should we count that as one morpheme or two morphemes? Okay, when I take the English word pregnant and do my linguistic analysis on it, there's the prefix pre, which means before. There's the suffix ant, which means state of being. And there's the gn in the middle, which is left over from the root gen, which is related to birth. And it means in the state of being before birth. Historically, it's 3 morphemes. Now, I would say it's 1. How do you count morphemes? That's why that question is always going to be problematic to answer.
Perfect. Thank you, Ronnie. I was very interested in the fact that you're kind of bringing back the whole discussion if non-manuals are prosodic in nature, or if they serve to syntax or semantics or any other components of grammar. And this is interesting because during your own work, you have changed sites, right? You have sometimes claimed that they are and
guilty as charged, yes.
but this is pretty interesting. But as far as I can see, we now seem to have a more clear cut when you have blinking as totally related to intonation and not intonation per se, but to prosodic cues in sign languages, and brow movement, for instance, related to other components of grammar, such as syntax or semantics. I was very interested to know if this has been tested in other sign languages. If you have this same pattern found, or if this is in your agenda to do something like that. And here's
the problem. And this has been a problem for a long time. When I look at brow raise in American Sign Language, I see something that behaves completely differently from brow lowering or negative head shake. Brow lowering and negative head shake both spread across all the signs in their domain. Okay? But I showed you all those examples of the brow raise that comes to a total halt, even though there's information after it. The spreading domain of brow raise is different in American Sign Language. So far, I have not yet found another non-manual that behaves like ASL brow raise. So looking at brow raise in other sign languages, looking at head, looking at, again, just about anything you could, squints, whatever it is. So far, nobody has identified something like the ASL brow raise, which I have looked at from a semantic operator point of view. It marks dyadic operators. It's restrictive. I have not even been able to find any sign language where all the restrictive structures have the same non-manual on them, even if it's not brow raise. I've even asked people, well, supposing it's possible to take all the restrictive ones and separate them, maybe there's a break there. Maybe there's subgroups of restrictive operators that no semanticist has yet had to think about. Maybe sign languages can tell us this. Supposing you have a group like conditionals and topics behave one way and relative clauses and behave a different way. That would be, so far, there's no other sign language that even comes close, in part because people don't understand the semantics and haven't been able to do all the work that you need on the non-manuals. So it could be, but I'll tell you, I don't know. As far as the moving forward on the prosody, though, I think that the former speech scientist in me, because I did my work first in speech science and then in phonology and then in sign language, I want to stick with the physics. Like Martha, we agree on looking at, trying to find the behavior in the hands to kind of get what that is. And this other stuff, it just needs more work.
Thank you, Ronnie. Andrea, do you have a question?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question. Hi. Well, Ronnie, first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for your marvelous, wonderful presentation. It was so interesting. And I've been reading your work, especially on syllables, because we are trying to analyze Libra's syllables, and your work has been very helpful. So thank you so much for that too. Okay, so one of the challenges that we have faced so far has to do with the variation across signers. So especially when we analyze the citation form, we've noticed that signers tend to repeat the sign many times, and we wonder why that happens. And another question we have thought about is, would you say that a lexical item has no fixed number of syllables, since it can vary, across signers and also in different contexts?
Let me start with your second question first. No, I would say that the lexical items have a place where they have a core existence. I'm laughing as you're asking the question because certainly know exactly what you're referring to. And at one point, I was attempting to test the hold movement hold model, and very, very quickly discovered that, each time it was repeated, it was different, and actually measured pieces of that. This would be decades ago. When I was doing that, I collected multiple occurrences of the same sign in different occurrences of stories. And I referred to the project as the Art Sign Project, because each time somebody used the HMH structure was different. Okay. And that's one reason why I don't think that's a useful thing. I really just don't. I mean, I think Brentari's model for syllable structure and so on really does what I think we need for that. Why they're repeating it over and over and over again, I do think that may be related to them not being sure that you're getting what they're doing. So if you record conversations, which is hard because you want one camera on one person on the other, you want them looking at each other and signing to each other, and I've done that. It's my impression that you wouldn't get those repetitions as much because they would be focusing on the content and not on the form. What I did find when I did that was that signers talking to each other can sign at the same time for a long period of time because one person's watching and the other person's watching and they're not looking at their own. And so the overlap between the two was on the order of seconds, whereas in speech that never happens. But I certainly know the problem that you've got. And if you're trying to figure out syllable structure or measuring syllables, we can talk, but been there, done that, and I don't envy you one bit.
Thank you so much.
If I may jump in, Ronnie and Andrea's chat. I was wondering, Ronnie, because one of the main ideas of Print-Ary's model is just to abandon the idea of segment and to try to look to the syllable in a very different way. Are we close to something like that in terms of suprasegmental phonology for sign languages? Maybe we're just trying to look and to capture these facts from a perspective that might not be the best option due to the modality.
Well, absolutely. The whole movement whole doesn't work. The Sandler's LML model doesn't work. If you want to see that, look at my paper on backwards signing. What it basically looks like is, I wouldn't use the term suprasegmental there. I'd say autosegmental. You've got autosegmental tiers. And what happens when you ask somebody to sign something backwards is they switch the values, the feature values, on the same tier. Okay? And if it's a single thing like contact, then they have to struggle with, okay? So some of them will interpret the movement to contact, and then their backwards version will be movement away from contact. Whereas other ones, something like this for the old sign for German, one person even gave me the other hand on top as a backwards version of it. So they struggle with what do we do? And I think that there's no evidence for there being any kind of segmental structure inside the syllable at all. And the tapping study, looking at where people tap. So Martha this morning talked about the finger pointing and for close speech gesture and the tongue, okay? And she had it right on that they were aligned, they're coordinated. Because there's a target. It's the burst from the consonant to the vowel in the stressed syllable. The tapping study, when we looked at the internal structure of each syllable and where the taps were, there's no target. The taps were evenly distributed across deciles or quintiles or whatever within the syllable. They just want to hit it. There's no place where we looked at, do they target where the contact is? Do they target, non-manual change? There's no target. It's different. And in a recent paper that I did with Evie Malaya, we looked at the envelope of the syllable in signing and in speech, defined mathematically. Okay, and they behave the same. So, one could argue that you only think there's consonants and vowels in sequence there because somebody labeled them for you one day. But the actual production in speech doesn't have consonants and vowels in it either.
Oh, okay. So I think this is our time limit. So Ronnie, thank you again so much for giving us this amazing talk this afternoon. And thank you everyone that's here watching us. And we have the next session is starting at 3:30 p.m. So you have 10 minutes to get some rest, get some food, go to the bathroom, and come back here. Okay, it's a different link, right, Andrea?
Yes, that's right. Thank you so much, Guilherme, again.
Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Ronnie Wilbur, for the talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Anderson, for interpreting.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
So I'll see you in 10 minutes.
Different YouTube link. Okay.
O amor é essa última oração pra salvar teu coração.